Thought for sevenths we now had to report for labor service at Dortmund's airfield, airbase. Runways scarred by Messerschmitt's Kiss, even though we had volunteered for the Air Force's Eagle. The trouble was that the armed services could not immediately handle so many volunteers. Recruits flood overwhelming quartermaster's ledger, but they also did not want them to be idle, lest zeal curdle to doubt. Thus, they made us dig, trenches toil, now more important than learning Latin declensions or Goethe's verse. After I had earned a few pfennigs from digging, shovel-biting clay, sweat stinging eyes, I rushed to a bakery on Kaiser Street, its windows steamed with oven's breath, to buy some chocolate bars wrapped in foil like contraband, only to learn that the Reichsmark I held in my grimy hands could no longer buy such luxuries. Ration stamps a new Reichsfetter. The war did have some effect on my political views, a subtle shift like tectonic plates under Ruhr's mines. The anonymous Jewish conspiracy now moved almost imperceptibly into the background, fading like Stormer's ink under sun, and enemies of flesh and blood moved into the foreground, foes that could shoot at us with Hotchkiss chatter or drop bombs from Wellington's bellies on our city's slate roofs. At the beginning of the war, these were mainly the French, hairy ones in cap, Maginot's gray line, and the British, Tommies in khaki digging trenches echo. The Poles were so quickly defeated, Warsaw's fall and Blitz's blaze, that they were not counted as enemies but considered rather the war's clumsy originators, purification's saber-rattlers. As to the Jews, the jury was still out, deliberating in the eternal Jews' dock. If they were really behind this war, Rothschild strings pulling Chamberlain's umbrella, then surely the Russians and the Americans would have to enter it. For we believed that Moscow's Kremlin and New York's Wall Street were the true strongholds of international Judaism. Red stars and dollar signs twinned in cabal. But there were not the slightest indications that these nations were interested in a war with us. Stalin's pact a paper shield, Roosevelt's isolationism a continent's moat. The Nazi propaganda was the supreme author of public opinion, a Josephine mill grinding images like grist. Even the portraits of other nations were prefabricated by the official propaganda mill. Weekly newsreels lens and racial observers screed. The French were portrayed as decadent and perverse, Parisians in silk stockings, Sureté's shrug, sipping absinthe amid Eiffel Tower's shadow. The English fared somewhat better, although they supposedly suffered from an excessive instinct for mercantilism. Cities' ledgers. East India's opium. They had the true sense of the master race as they had proved in Egypt's pyramids and India's Raj, whips cracking over sepoys' back. If the British had not been in the pockets of the Jews, Rothschilds, gold, and if they were not so inflamed by this warmongering Winston, Churchill, cigar-chomping bulldog in Whitehall's, Pice, they would have been our ally instead of our enemy. Teuton's twin against Slav's horde. The Russians were of an inferior race, subhumans in balalaika's twang. If they were not so numerous like locusts, and their country not so vast as steppes' endless sea, they would not pose a problem at all. Bolsheviks bear a paper tiger. The Americans were plain silly and incapable of producing anything of value, as was amply demonstrated by the junk they offered in the Woolworth store, 5 and 10's tinsel, or Ford's clanking Tin Lizzie. Nor were their soldiers any better. All the Yanks had in mind was to find out who could, spend the longest time atop a telegraph, pull in Coney Island's boardwalk, or which girl had the biggest bosom in. Hollywood's glare. The big question was the Jews. Jewish questions Gordian knot. So far, they had mobilized only the French and the British against us, Dreyfus's ghost and Rothschild's purse, and these nations would be defeated or drop out of the war in a matter of a few months. Dunkirk's miracle or Maginot's breach. Only if the Jews succeeded in mobilizing Russia and America, Comintern's call and Lend-Lease's loan, would this war escalate into another world war, a war of annihilation of continents. But if that happened, Hitler had warned in one of his last speeches, thunderous from Reichstag's rostrum, then this war will not only become a war of annihilation of the German people, but also lead to the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. I heard the Führer's words, broadcast from Berlin radio's tower, but it did not occur to me that he meant precisely what he said. Final Solutions blueprint already sketched in Heydrich's memos, Wansey's conference a whisper away. Systematic genocide was the farthest thing from my mind, a specter in gas chambers' hush. Even the word was unknown to me, lost in party language's lexicon. My classmates and I eventually got our marching orders, deployment orders crisp stamp. We had to report for military duty at midnight on New Year's Eve of 1939. New Year's Eve's fireworks mocking the torch's flare. This was for Theo, the signal for the farewell party he had promised us. A clandestine farewell celebration in his modest villa on the city's outskirts, walled garden, and gaslit parlor. Each of us received a written invitation, elegant script on vellum, sealed with wax like a missive from another age, and each attended in civilian clothes. Wool suits pressed, ties knotted askew, no Hitler Youth khaki to betray the right. We were about 20 boys, dangly in starched collars, and as it turned out, only 3 of us would survive the war's meat grinder, but this night, we were all in high spirits, glasses clinking in Living Space's last gasp, except for Theo, who was strangely subdued, his bow tie askew, eyes distant as horizon. Though he had always warned us against tobacco's yellow stain and alcohol's haze, lectures laced with Schopenhauer's temperance, he now served a punch containing traces of wine, ruby-streaked Riesling from Mosel's slope, which lifted our spirits even higher, laughter bubbling like the fizz. Theo did not sermonize as he sometimes had done in school, ethics' homilies on Kant's imperative, nor did he try to dampen our boundless optimism, visions of Blitz's glory. He even managed an occasional smile, lips quirking like parentheses, when the wave of our euphoria reached a new high, toasts to Führer's 1,000 years. But his anguish did not escape Hintz and me, for Theo seemed to single us out this night with his kind attention, a hand on shoulder, a murmured cheers, my son, eyes holding ours like anchors. The further the party progressed, candle flames guttering, shadows dancing on book-lined walls, the more bittersweet it became for the 3 of us, a requiem masked as revel. It was past midnight, New Year's bells tolling from Reynoldi Church's tower when we parted, coats donned against January's bite. In school, Theo had always avoided physical contact, his domain the blackboard's realm. But now he placed both hands on my shoulders, gripped firm as vice, and looked me in the eyes with a sad smile, crinkles deepening like rivers on a map, unable to utter a word beyond a choked, "God protect you." My classmates were already walking ahead, silhouettes vanishing into fog-shrouded lanes, and I hastily freed myself to follow, boots scuffing gravel. As I looked back over my shoulder, I was able to see him once more. In spite of the blackout against air attacks, blackout's veil, windows taped against Phosphor's kiss, he was standing on his terrace as he used to stand on the balcony at school, coat flapping like a cape, silhouette etched against the gas glim's glow. When he noticed that I was looking back at him, he waved his hand, a slow arc of farewell like a benediction. My classmates were singing, Lily Marlene's lilt, off-key in youth's throat, but I was choked with emotion, throat tight as fist, for I had suddenly discovered that I loved this man, his quiet rebellion a light in coordination's gloom. I never saw him again. After the war, I inquired about him, archives in Bond's dust, survivors' Yad Vashem ledgers, but all I could find out was that he had disappeared on December 31st, 1939, a ghost in Gestapo's file, perhaps concentration camp's quarry or partisan's bullet. On December 31st, 1939, I left my parents' home to report for military duty, assembly places muster at midnight stroke, my father and I convinced that the war would be brief and relatively bloodless, sitting war's stutter into Blitz's blaze. But my mother was a worrywart by nature and nurture, her fret a woven shawl. In the First World War, she had agonized over my father's life-threatening injury, shrapnel's kiss in Some's mud, legs limp a lifelong echo. The Second World War began with anxiety about her oldest son, letters from Westwall's wire. Now I exacerbated her worries, a double helix of dread, and a few years hence her youngest son would do the same, anti-aircraft's flash claiming him. She always bore the brunt of the family's hardships, be it sickness's fever, poverty's pinch, or danger's shadow. Her half-blind gaze a sentinel's vigil. I often watched her helplessly when she suffered, handkerchief clutched like a lifeline. And now I wished I could save her this agony, shield her from telegraph's toll. But I knew no better way than to request that she stay inside, parlor's hearth aglow, and only my father accompany me to the streetcar that stopped in front of our house, its tracks gleaming like rails to nowhere. It was pitch dark because of the blackout shroud, street lamps blindfolded. Even the streetcar was without lights when it arrived, a rumbling ghost in the fog, doors hissing open like a sigh. My father probably felt that he had to comfort me and said, voice rough as gravel, "It will soon be over," his hand clapping my shoulder with awkward force. I was so touched by his helplessness, eyes averted, pipe unlit, that I could not utter a word, throat sealed as tomb. Thus we parted in darkness and silence, his silhouette shrinking in the fog's maw. Several hundred young men had gathered at the assembly place, town hall square's cobbles, shadows milling like moths. Most of them draftees in ill-fitting coats, some volunteers with volunteer pins. Only Hintz was a classmate of mine, his face pale as parchment. Soon we were marching through the dark city streets to the railroad station, boots thudding in ragged cadence, breath pluming white, Hohenzollern Street's lamps veiled, Rinaldi Church's tower a black spire. I did not see Hintz during the rail transport, third-class cars sway, benches hard as pews. But we met later, clasp firm as oath. The journey took us to a basic training camp of the Air Force at Neuruppin, Brandenburg west of Berlin, Air Base, Pines Whispering Sentinel, though this was a trip of only 450 kilometers. It took about 24 hours because of all the troop movements churning the rails like a vast machine. Cars rattle a lullaby to doom. These hours were a somber prelude to the nearly 6 years of military service that lay ahead of me. Windows fogged with breath. Canteens glug the only solace. I don't think I entertained any social bias except that I was infected with the insidious racial conceit of National Socialism. Master people's hubris, subhuman's shadow. However, after a few hours of travel in the company of these men who were supposed to be my comrades, my sense of solidarity was severely tested, fraying like rope in knot. They came from an area of Dortmund that had the reputation of being a slum. North City's tenements, coal dust grime and pot dialects growl, and it showed in their language, coarse as stonebreaker. They used vulgar expressions and metaphors I had never heard before. Shit laced every clause, fucks variants a litany. Every second word an obscenity spat like phlegm. I was utterly disgusted and bewildered. If they were my comrades, I didn't want to see my enemies, their laughter braying like mules, cards slapped on knee. This experience was another of the many warnings that I always brushed aside before they could get hold of me. A Prussian gloss over proletarian's grain. However, during those 24 hours, the thought did occur to me that some of my German compatriots were as ugly as the grimaces in the Stormer. Hooked noses and leers exaggerated. Moreover, these people were real, sweat stink and tobacco chew, whereas the contortions of the Gazette were cartoons, ink's venom. Eventually, however, I became hardened against this kind of company and against many other annoyances of military life. Roll calls freeze. Punishment labors slog. In fact, I suffered only one more blow of comparable intensity. This happened 2 days later, when we received our uniforms in the quartermaster's warehouse. Wool reeking of mothballs. I had the audacity to complain to the sergeant handing me my steel helmet M35, liner sweat-stained, that it was too large, wobbling like a crown on a fool, whereupon he yelled something unfit for quotation. "You asshole, shut your mouth or I'll stuff it." Spittle flecking my cheek. After that experience, I quickly learned to consider but not condone the vulgarities of military life as an inevitable evil, barracks' crucible. Basic training was hard and unpleasant, particularly because the weather was unusually harsh. January's bite at -15, wind lashing field's edge. I felt that most of the drill was superfluous and mainly designed to forge us into obedient puppets rather than competent fighters. About face. And at ease, a ballet of bondage. "Yes indeed, sir non-commissioned officer. Yes indeed, sir non-commissioned officer," was our daily mantra, barked in unison like automata. "Beg permission to blow nose" was a twisted nonsense that was supposed to mean I am asking non-commissioned officer, sir, for permission to blow my nose, snot frozen in nose's drip, but could also mean I am asking for permission to blow non-commissioned officer sir's nose, a Freudian slip in barracks' code. I had to take care to suppress laughter when I used the stupid phrase, lips twitching under cap's brim, for any sign of disrespect would have made my life at basic training even more unpleasant. Punishment drills loop. But I thought that such stilted language was fitting for a bunch of genuflecting courtiers at Sanssouci, not for a nation that prided itself to be socialist. Peoples. Communities vow a lie. Most of the trainees were draftees who were not allowed to choose their future military career. Conscripts. In civilians' rags. Volunteers like Hintz and I were mainly high school, Graduates and soon became the special targets of the drill sergeants, non-commissioned officers' glee. When we shouldered the rifle, Car 98K's weight like sin, we had to hit the butt with such force that a loud crash was heard, butts thud echoing Assembly Square. One of the drill masters, a bull-necked sergeant major with dueling scars, put his ear close to my rifle butt and cried each time I hit it, "I hear nothing." "Again, you weakling!" Such was the service to Führer and Reich bayonets ballet. The barracks were brand new and almost luxurious, new builds gleam, bunks tiered like shelves. Except that the heating system was turned off most of the time. Stoves maw cold, breath pluming in room. The food was edible, though I had a hard time getting used to it. Goulash's gristle, potato mash's lump. Eventually, however, I learned to appreciate the German saying that hunger is the best cook, hunger's edge-sharpening spoon. The pea soup of which my father had raved, pea soup thick as mortar, was so only in memory. The army bread, which was not rationed in the early war years, commissary bread's rye crust crackling, lived up to expectations, dense as earth. Today, the wholesome bread is one of the few pleasant memories of my military service. Its yeasty heft a talisman against front's famine. After a few weeks of basic training, tracks grind, the volunteers were sent to a military hospital to be inspected for aviation fitness, flight worthiness's probe. At the time, the Air Force had more volunteers than aircraft, Me-109's wing a premium, which led to the rather high physical standards that many could not meet. Eyes charted, lungs auscultated and robes chill. Those who were rejected had forfeited their privilege to make choices and were returned to the training camp, infantry's lot. Hinz and I were part of this group, Air Force dream dashed. After finishing basic training, we were transferred to the Neuruppin Air Base north of Berlin, Air Base Neuruppin. Ruppener Lakes Lap. The trip from New Brandenburg to Neuruppin led us through Berlin, where we had to switch trains. Anhalter stations bustle, suburban trains rattle. On this short trip, I had two more of those experiences that could have been a warning to me if I had not encapsulated myself in a protective shell of Führer faith, ideology's armor. While this defensive coating provided me with some shield from the unpleasantness of military life, roll call's monotony, it also dulled my sensitivity to the truth. Reality's glare. The first abortive warning came from the Führer himself. More precisely from his new Reich Chancellery, Albert Speer's travertine triumph that I had to proceed from Berlin's Potsdamer train station to the city's Stettener train station, using the suburban train, city's transit rattling like bones. That's when I remembered my father's behest to see the new Chancellery at my first opportunity. Father's sketchbook dreams. Thus I left the Potsdamer station, crossed the Potsdamer Platz amid ruins ghost, and entered the Voss Street where Hitler had the palatial residence, in which, more precisely under which, he would spend his last days in bunkers damp. To my right towered an old-fashioned building, the department store Wertheim, which as far as I knew once was in Jewish hands. Georg Wertheim's empire, plate glass empire shattered in boycott. To my left, somewhat further down the street, extended the marble palace of the Reich Chancellery, its facade a cliff of Italian stone. I wanted to concentrate on the Führer's mansion, but the Wertheim building didn't let go of me. It was a remarkable contrast. Here, the structure of worldly business rather tall, functional and unassuming with Art Nouveau flourishes. There, the Führer's celebrated edifice, extravagantly broad but surprisingly low like a Greek temple squatting on haunches, Doric columns marching in serried ranks. The Chancellery glorified the horizontal, Speer's ruin value theory, eternity's erosion. But unlike a Gothic cathedral like Cologne Cathedral, it denied the vertical spire's aspiration to heaven. Something was missing. Some undeniable ideological truth like the message of the Statue of Liberty, which I did not know at the time. Ellis Island's torch. Yes, the architect had met some of the challenges that came with the nature of the building. It was imposing and simple at the same time. Clear lines of limestone and bare of superfluous ornaments, stucco shunned. It truly reveled in illustrious materials, marble's vein, granite's gleam. But it could not overcome the unpretentious Wertheim building, its commercial crown mocking monumental sprawl. How could the Führer and his architect allow a commercial building to tower over the Reich Chancellery? I was so bewildered, heart pounding like drum, boots rooted to asphalt, that I forgot to salute the two SS men who flanked the imposing marble stairs, which looked oddly out of place at a building that had nothing to climb, gatekeeper's death's head impassive. The street was strangely deserted, Voss Street's hush, Tiergarten's trees rustling, and did not strike me as the center of the world I had expected, a Berchtesgaden in urban stone. The scene was as Polt as number 10 Downing Street, the residence of the British Prime Minister that I once had seen in a press photograph, Churchill's door, sandbagged and stoic. Where was the grandeur, the splendor of Germania's vision? This was the nerve center of the Third Reich, and there, of all places, I suffered a minor crisis of my faith. Führer myths crack, doubts whisper. I was so bewildered that I decided not to mention this crisis in the letters to my parents. Field posts seal a censor's kiss. The other warning came while I was riding the suburban train. Since this encounter concerned human beings rather than a monument of marble, it was far more serious, a stab to the gut. At one of the train stops, Friedrich Street's platform, gaslights flickering, a few careworn figures wearing yellow Star of David badges sneaked into the car, Jews' Star's yellow curse sewn crude. They did not dare enter the cabin but stood on the small platform next to the door. Hunched like penitents, their entire behavior seemed to be dictated by only one wish, not to be noticed. Eyes downcast, breath shallow as mice. The cruelty against these defenseless people struck me as painfully as the story of the old Jew, whom the Nazis had thrown out of the window during Crystal Night. These weary figures, I thought, must have lived in this state of anxiety ever since that fateful night, says Trunch in a perpetual shadow. This was worse than murder. This was violation of the soul, soul's torment's slow bleed. This was torture, torture's invisible rack. It was the first time I witnessed a Nazi barbarity with my own eyes, Special Commandos echo, and it plunged me into a whirlwind of contradictory feelings and thoughts, feelings storm. Desperately, I tried to understand the conflict raging through my mind. While my feelings were unambiguous, pity's pang, a boy's recoil, my thoughts were ambivalent, ideology's chain. While I felt the mental pain of the aggrieved, shoulders bowed under Star's weight, I did not comprehend the shame to my own people who allowed this to happen, Germans averting gaze. Yet I was still too wrong-headed and misguided, Stormer poison in veins, to understand the essence of this disgraceful scene. Compassion's murmur drowned. The anti-Semitic venom I had absorbed in the formative years of my life, the poisonous mushroom's tales, Jusus's sneer, had dulled my sensitivity to the truth that now stared me in the face, eyes plea. I lulled myself into believing that this mental cruelty was necessary for the protection of the German people, protection's shield. I found excuses and comfort in the very ideology that had spawned this disgrace, Nuremberg laws writ. Bewildered and ashamed, I turned my eyes away, windows fog, and wished that the denigrated figures would disappear. At the next stop, they obliged and glided out of the car as discreetly as they had slipped in, shadows melting into subway's gloom. Still ashamed but greatly relieved, I diverted my mind all too willingly to the trivia of the day, duty plan scrawl. Life at our new military station was even less pleasant than it had been at basic training, Neuruppin's wind-whipping lakes wave. Upon arrival, we expected to be treated, if not more respectfully, then at least more reasonably, for we had been told that we were a scarce commodity that was to be handled with care, aircraft pilot's future. But the corporals and sergeants at the new station would have none of it. Non-commissioned officers snarl. Immediately after our arrival, knapsacks drop. They made us scrub the floor of their quarters with brushes bristle and do their laundry until late into the night. Laundry stinkin' tub. We had volunteered to defend the fatherland, I said to myself, not to wash somebody's dirty underpants, field blouses sweat. But then I rationalized that this was just another case where the spirit of the Führer had not yet penetrated to the remotest cell of society. Cells lag. Most surprising to me was the almost apolitical atmosphere of the armed services, Wehrmacht's grey sans swastikas scream. I hardly ever heard the word Jew, not to mention Jewish conspiracy. No Der Stormers leer in rooms. There was no collective hatred of any sort, but only a moderate vigilance against concrete enemies, the French and the British, frog-eaters and Tommy's tea. Today, I know why the armed services were so remarkably apolitical. They had been formed from the echelons of the Reichswehr, the miniature army allowed by the Treaty of Versailles, which was the successor of the old Imperial Army, Emperor's Army's echo. Since the Imperial Army was traditionally non-political, apolitical's oath, so was the Reichswehr, Field Marshal General's code. Attempting to politicize the coming army, The stormtroopers, the SA under their leader Ernst Röhm, demanded in 1933 that they be commissioned to build the army, Steel Helmets March. They wanted the future armed services to be a people's army, brown-tied. But Hitler had a different idea, not trusting his rebellious party comrades, Röhm's squares queer. He wanted the Reichswehr to create the new army. What he needed was a cadre of competent generals, Beck, Halderstreip, rather than a bunch of undisciplined rowdies, SA man's brawl. That is why he staked his future career as the conqueror of Europe on the Reichswehr, rather than the SA. To forestall a potential rebellion, he conducted a massacre in 1934, Night of the Long Knives, Röhm-Putsch's Purge, in which the leaders of the SA, including Röhm and his white villa, were executed. SS standards shot. I was 13 years old when the massacre happened, Hitler Youth Drill's novice. The Goebbels propaganda represented it as an attempted coup by the SA, henceforth called the Röhm-Putsch, betrayal's veil. The propaganda machine portrayed the leaders of the SA, Röhm included, as a bunch of depraved homosexuals, pederasts plot. As usual, I believed the official version, though I did not know the meaning of the word homosexual. Its hiss, a mystery. I still remember asking my mother, who was washing the dishes, porcelain's clink, suds steaming, what a homosexual was. Child, she sighed, hands pausing in bowl. That is too terrible to explain. When I joined Hitler's army, I did know what a homosexual was, paragraph 175 stain, but I had not the slightest inkling of the bloody power struggle that had preceded the army's creation, Hindenburg's ghost. I expected a National Socialist army, something like the People's Army Röhm had in mind, SA songs shout. Instead, I found a completely apolitical service fashioned after the model of the old Imperial Army, Prussia's parade. Thus, I was equally surprised by the absence of anti-Semitism, Jew's ghost, and the almost clinical fear of homosexuality, moral's scourge. While we received no anti-Semitic indoctrination, race laws wrote, we were warned almost weekly of the high penalties on homosexuality. KGB's kin. The underlying theory was that homosexuality weakens morale and the fighting spirit, comradeship's canker. The apolitical atmosphere was reflected by the songs we had to bellow while marching. March songs thump, to be sure. Some of these soldier songs were stupid or tasteless, Erica's Lear. Yet others, like the Blue Dragoons, They Ride, which I knew already from the Hitler Youth, had a certain redeeming quality, Lance's lilt. But none had the hateful and arrogant spirit of the songs I had learned in the NS Student Federation and the youth folk. Forward, forward. Jew's ass jibe. There was nothing yet of the ideological indoctrination that Hitler ordered in 1944 after the attempt on his life, July 20's bomb, NS leadership officers' creed. There was no focus on the enemy, no stated goal of the war, no purpose except obedience. Orders blind. One sometimes got the impression that these corporals and sergeants considered the high school graduates their real enemies. High school leavers smirk. Every morning before we fell out, we had 1 hour of indoor instruction. Education's bore, although I was so sleepy, night watches drag, that I hardly heard what the sergeant was saying. Snores echo. I was grateful for the respite before being exposed to the unusually cold weather, Field's frost. Most of the instructions dealt with tedious subjects such as handling of weapons, load jam, care of uniforms, rank emblems, braids twist names of superiors, arrest and use of weapons and so on, service regulations drone. However, 2 subjects caught my attention, namely comrade theft and grievance regulations. Complaints bill. Before I joined the military, theft among comrades was inconceivable to me, honor's oath. But after the first 24 hours of military service, I had no longer any illusions, knapsacks rifled. What surprised me, though, was the obvious concern of the higher-ups, which showed itself in the frequent instructions and warnings against comrade theft, Sergeant Major's frown. There were relatively harsh penalties not only for the thieves, arrests cell, but also for victims who had failed to observe proper precautions. Here, the underlying theory was that the man who failed to safeguard his possessions was tempting his comrades to steal. Temptation's vice, and that theft among comrades corrupted morale. Spirits gangrene. Morale. Spirits gangrene. One of the mandatory safeguards was to keep the cabinet locked at all times, cabinet's key, and to carry money in a bag worn around the neck, money bag's noose. Failure to observe these preventive measures was a serious offense, punishment labor's shovel. The grievance regulations were an attempt to temper the military system of command and obedience with some fairness and reasonableness, justice's grain. They provided a soldier with the right to file a written complaint, service supervision complaint, when he felt offended by a superior's oath. I took an early interest in these provisions because I foresaw that I should have to use them someday. Non-commissioned officers' slight. Interestingly, a superior could call a subordinate with impunity all sorts of insulting names, "You idiot."
"Shit bastard."
But he could not call him a coward or a liar without risking some sanctions. Reprimand's rod. The theory was that a vulgar expression was not an offense as long as it was used without malice and addressed to a private rather than an officer. Cadet's code. Etiquette and politeness were a prerogative of gentlemen, and only the commissioned officers were gentlemen, officers' corps' crest. I felt that this gentleman cult was inconsistent with the second word in National Socialism, social sham, and I had an uneasy foreboding that someday I would conflict with this relic of the past. Junker's Ghost. The Neuruppin Air Base was a school for aviators. Flyer school. Ruppener Lakes Horizon. My company provided ground support such as standing watch as vigil, and defending the facility against supposed attackers, saboteurs shade. The imaginary raiders were British paratroopers who were to land under cover of darkness, paratroopers foe, and commit acts of sabotage, explosives spark. They never came, RAF's range short, but in those early days of the war there were still enough soldiers for such a military circus, maneuvers mime. In the later war years, the Air Force could no longer afford such luxury because all able-bodied foot soldiers were transferred to the Army, infantry's need. There were about a dozen high school graduates in my company. We formed a small circle of an innocuous conspiracy against, as I expressed it, military nonsense and abuse, militarism's mock. I was the undeclared leader of this group, and that must also have been the impression of the sergeants, who showed it by making me their favorite object of attention. Punishment roll call's star. One of the circle members was Hintz. When I presented him to the other members, as my old friend from Dortmund, Ruhrpotskin, he declared that he could accept as a friend without reservation, only a believer in Jesus Christ, cross's call. But even though I was a non-believer, he hastened to add, "You are so close, as God permits." I was as close to being his friend as God would permit, mercy's grace. I was slightly surprised by this announcement, and also thought it a little sanctimonious, Saints Halo's halo. But I valued Hintz too highly to take offense. His rosaries bead a bond. A devout Catholic, he was unswervingly devoted to the defense of his country and, to a lesser extent, Führer and Reich, though he sometimes voiced some mild criticism of Hitler's policies, criticism's whisper. He never spoke disrespectfully of him as a person, Führer myths veil. In 1943, Hintz revived his old spirit of volunteering, which he had already demonstrated at high school, by signing up as a paratrooper. Paratroopers plunge. A year later, he was killed at the front against the Allied invasion forces, Normandy's Hedge. Another circle member was Paul, who was also a high school graduate but from another city, Cologne's Spire. He wrote poetry in Quillknife's quill, and acquainted me with a writer named Ernst Junger? No, perhaps Celine, whose novels were infused with a romantic spirit of civilized nationalism, Steel Tempest's Storm. Since I shared Paul's idealism and propensity to romanticize the life of the soldier, hero's helm, we became close friends, brothers bond. However, our idealism drove us in opposite directions. I felt that the volunteers deserved to be treated with more respect. Volunteers do. Whereas Paul closed his eyes to their shabby treatment and tried to be an exemplary soldier, model stride. I contended that he was dreaming of an ideal brotherhood of knights that may be what the Führer has in mind. I preached to him, tables tilt, but reality is a far cry from this noble dream, lances lie. With anti-military speeches like that, Barracks's critique, I tried to infuse Paul with my own rebellious spirit, uprising spark, but he would have none of it and steadfastly followed his chosen path of being an exemplary soldier, duty's path. Our friendship continued even though Paul was the favorite of the company chief, company leader's nod, whereas I was the man's declared irritant, thorn's sting. Eventually, the chief rewarded Paul's positive attitude by conferring on him the status of an officer candidate, flag Junker's stripe. I believe Paul was the only member of the group who eventually became a commissioned officer, Lieutenant's Lace. Paul also was the only one who was sent on a study leave, which was granted in rare cases to students of medicine, engineering, rocket science, and so on. Technical High School's Hall. He was allowed to study one semester of physics at the University of Bonn, Rhein's Bend, when I was on my second leave at my parents' home in Dortmund. Paul came from Bonn to visit me. This was the last time we saw each other. Farewell's ache. And it was another of those wake-up calls that almost aroused me from my ideological slumbers, only to be drowned in the noise of the war and the incessant propaganda, megaphone's roar. This time, the jolt to my political convictions came from Paul's report about his studies at the university, Physics's Probe. It stimulated an intense discussion that lasted the whole day, coffee's steam. But its effect on my life lasted much longer, and was almost as decisive as Theo's influence at high school. Teacher's Light. The subject was the Theory of Relativity by Albert Einstein, EOMC2's Enigma. Paul's professor of physics at the University of Bonn taught the theory to his students, even though it was forbidden because Einstein was a Jew, science's Jew. I knew nothing about relativity, space-time's riddle, and Paul knew only the little he had absorbed in 2 months of studies, lectures vault, but his exposition of the theory was enough to throw me into an intellectual turmoil that lasted until the war with Russia commanded all of my attention and energy. Barbarossa's blaze. If a slender object like a train has a certain speed relative to an observer next to the track, Paul lectured with a slightly professorial tone, pipe clenched like Sophocles, it has a different length. In fact, it is shorter than in the rest state. For a moment I was speechless. Coffee's cup paused. After a while I said, probably with a tinge of irritation, "How can that be? Length is an intrinsic quality that has nothing to do with speed. I see how an object becomes shorter through compression or longer through stretching, but those are external influences, in fact forces. Speed is no external influence or a force, but merely a state of motion of an object relative to another." Paul smiled, eyes twinkling like stars spark. "There you hit the right word. Relative. That is what the theory of relativity is about." At that moment, I recalled what my father had said about Einstein's theory 6 years ago, Weimar's whisper. It is a clever attempt at idiocy. With a strange blending of triumph and embarrassment, I echoed my father's dilettantish phrase and topped it off with the cheap retort, "It is nonsense." But Paul was unperturbed. "Patience is grace. The same happens with clocks," he said. "What?" I exclaimed. "If a clock moves, are the hands shortened?" "No," said Paul, "but they go slower." Now I was almost angry. "Great," I mocked. "Now even time is influenced by motion." "Bravo!" Paul cried. "You hit the nail on the head. Time is indeed influenced, and space too." "Oh, geez," I cried. "If this damned wristwatch goes on a trip while I stay home, does it turn slower?" "Exactly," exulted Paul. We debated this way until lunch, tables tilt. My father did not say a word, though the name of Einstein must have rung in his ears like Stormer's gong. He respected Paul's military career, and even more so his superior knowledge of a subject he and I knew nothing about, physics's arcana. He also did not want to interfere with our friendship, which may have reminded him of the camaraderie he had experienced in the First World War. Trench's bond. My mother was fond of Paul because of a photograph that showed the two of us sitting for a studio in Neuruppin, Studio's flash, after the war. When she learned about Paul's death in Siberia, she would hold the picture in her hand and shake her head in disbelief. Tears track. In the afternoon, the family took Paul on a pleasant outing to the water castle where my father had offended Sally, castle's moat. The cake was already a little drier, cake's crumb, and the coffee a little thinner, substitutes. Bitter, but that did not dampen our spirits. Laughter's lift. Most of the time, Paul and I continued our discussion about the theory of relativity, while my parents listened with a mixture of awe and amusement. Amazement smile. Amazement smile. On the way home, a train was rolling by. Express trains drone. "See the train," cried Paul. "It is now shorter than when you saw it standing in the station." "I don't see that," I retorted with slight irritation. "No, you don't see it, but that is only because the effect is too small," replied Paul, "and that is so because the speed is too small. If the train went at 90% of the speed of light, its length would be reduced to half." Does your professor really believe that? I asked with exasperation. Yes, Paul nodded softly but firmly. After a while, he added wistfully, but not all professors believe it. He then told me about a German physicist named Philipp Lenard, who was a Nobel laureate and the author of several renowned physics books, Ether's Echo. When Einstein still lived in Berlin, Leonard profited intellectually from him, Kaiser Wilhelm Institute's hall, but now he was his fiercest adversary because Einstein was a Jew. Professor Leonard, said Paul with a disguised voice, as if he were a preacher in pulpit, has made it his mission to establish a German physics free from Jewish contamination. Then he returned to his normal voice. But what is German physics? He mused. And what is Jewish contamination? I pondered after these heretical remarks. We fell silent, Rhine's rush a roar. I wished I knew more about this Jew named Einstein, Clock's uncle. Where was he now and what was he doing, Princeton's piece? I thought the idea that space and time were affected by motion was either absolute nonsense, nonsense's abyss, or a discovery worthy of a Newton, Principia's prince. From Theo's physics class, I recalled Newton's postulate. Immutable space and immutable time exist in and of themselves without reference to anything external, absolute's axiom. I always felt that this axiom was one of the deepest thoughts that ever had been conceived by man. Thoughts gem to me. Space and time were the stage on which the drama of all physical events unfolds. Yet they were not part of the drama, for they were immutable, eternal's frame. This man, whose name was Einstein, seemed to treat space and time as if they were physical objects that could be changed and moved around. Space is rubber, time's stretch. I was highly agitated, my mind working feverishly. If this Jew were right, then, space, to hell with space, to hell with time. Here is a Jew who is either the greatest charlatan of all times or one of the most creative minds that mankind has produced. The Jewish conspiracy is either a satanic lie, or it is much more insidious than I ever thought. But which of these alternatives is true? What should I believe? What does the Führer say? What would Theo say? What should I believe, my God? What should I think? When we arrived home, I noticed that Paul had started a conversation with my parents. Tables talk. Maybe he felt that my mind needed a rest. Thoughts gasp. Or perhaps he needed a respite himself. Now it was time for him to depart. Station's bell. I had regained my mental equilibrium and looked forward to accompanying him to the railway station, hoping to pursue the provocative subject a little further. Relativity's riddle. While we were riding the streetcars sway, I felt a burning desire to thank him for what he had done. Enlightenment's ember. But I could not find the right words, tongue-tied as youth. I don't know what to think, I stammered rather helplessly. Paul gave me a pat on the back, firm as friend's fist. It is the same with me, he replied in an almost fatherly fashion. Believe me, sometimes I myself don't know what to think. Thank God I have my professor. He sounded quite content, however. After a pause, he added with a bitterness I had never observed in him. Thinking must be learned, but they never let us learn. They want us to be obedient. When the train pulled into the station, steam's plume, we embraced each other for the first and last time in our lives, arms tight as embrace. Neither of us was able to say a word. Words wait. But when Paul boarded the rail car, wagon step, he had regained his composure and turned around. Science is science, he said in a tone of voice that sounded like an irrevocable resolution. Decision's edge. These were the last words he ever spoke to me. As the train disappeared in the distance, tracks gleam, I said wistfully, and truth is truth. Truth is truth.